Here's what nobody tells you about asking for a raise. The conversation isn't between you and your boss. It's between your boss and a compensation system built long before you walked in, with merit matrices, calibration meetings, and budget pools locked months ahead. Most people rehearse what to say to a person, when the real obstacle is a process. I've sat on the other side of that process, inside compensation planning and calibration rooms, watching raises get approved and watching them get killed. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how that system works and how to negotiate with it. I'm Dre. I spent years inside corporate systems most employees never get to see, in recruiting and compensation planning, sitting in the calibration meetings where raises actually get decided. Not the meeting you have with your boss, the one that happens before that, in a room you're never invited to, where your name gets discussed by people who've never met you, usually alongside a spreadsheet with everyone else on your level lined up next to you. That's often the moment your raise really gets decided, long before your boss ever sits down across from you. I make videos breaking down exactly how those systems work, so you're not walking into a negotiation blind. If that's useful, stick around and consider subscribing, because I put mechanics like this out regularly. And this channel exists specifically to hand you the view from the other side of the table. Most people think asking for a raise is about proving they work hard. It usually isn't. Hard work is often the entry fee, not the argument. What actually moves a raise through the system is different from what moves your boss emotionally, and those two things get confused constantly. Your boss might genuinely like you, might genuinely think you deserve more, and still walk out of that calibration meeting empty-handed because the case wasn't built the way the system needed it built. That's often the part that stings the most, feeling like you did everything right and still got told no, without ever fully understanding why. That's not cynicism. That's just how the machinery works. And once you understand the machinery, the conversation gets a lot less scary, because you stop taking a process failure as a personal one. So let's get into it. 10 things I tell you before you walk into that room. Number 1, build the case before you build the ask. This is the part people skip because it's uncomfortable. Before you say a word to your boss, sit down and get honest with yourself about whether the value you're creating has actually grown, or whether you've just been busy. Busy and valuable are not the same thing, and in my experience, the people reviewing these requests can usually tell the difference even when your boss can't. If you've taken on real scope, solved real problems, moved numbers that matter, that's a case. If you've mostly been present and stretched thin, that's a different conversation, and no negotiation script fixes that gap. Here's a quick gut check. If someone asked you to list 3 specific things that changed because you were the one doing this job and not someone else, could you answer in under a minute? If you can, you likely have a real case. If you're struggling to name anything beyond showing up and getting through the list, that's a sign to build more evidence before you build the ask, not a sign to abandon the conversation altogether. Get honest here first, because everything after this step is just packaging. Number 2, know 2 numbers, not 1. Most people research the external market rate and stop there. What similar roles pay elsewhere? What job postings are listing? That matters, but it's only half the picture. The other number is your internal band, the range your company has already assigned to your level, whether or not anyone's told you what it is. In systems I've worked in, most roles sit inside a predefined range, and a raise usually moves you up within that range rather than past it. If you're already near the top of your band, market research alone won't get you past that ceiling in one conversation, and pushing hard against it can leave your boss stuck defending a request they simply don't have the authority to grant. In that situation, the more useful ask often becomes a path to the next level, rather than a bigger number inside the level you're already in. Knowing which situation you're actually in changes what you ask for, and it can save you from a frustrating conversation where your boss agrees with you completely and still can't do anything about it. Number 3, ask for a number, not a feeling. Walking in and saying you'd like to be paid more is easy for your boss to nod at and just as easy for them to forget. It doesn't give them anything to bring back to that calibration room. A specific number does. Something like, based on my research, I'm looking to move to a certain figure and here's why. That single sentence hands your boss a concrete request they can advocate for, instead of a vague feeling they have to translate into a business case themselves. Most managers won't do that translation work for you, so do it for them. It also protects you from a common outcome where a vague ask gets a vague answer. Something like, we'll look into it, which can quietly go nowhere for months because nobody was ever given a specific target to work toward in the first place. Number 4, make the case about value created, not effort spent. This is one of the clearest patterns I saw sitting in calibration meetings. The raises that moved through cleanly were framed around what changed because of the person, not how hard the person worked to get there. Effort is invisible to a spreadsheet. Outcomes usually aren't. If you can tie your ask to something that actually moved, revenue, retention, a process that stopped costing time or money, you're no longer asking your boss to feel generous. You're giving them a business reason to say yes. And business reasons tend to survive calibration meetings a lot better than good feelings do. In practice, your boss often has to repeat your case in a shortened form to someone who has never worked with you. If your entire justification depends on tone or on being remembered as well-liked and hard-working, very little of that survives being retold secondhand. A concrete outcome does. Number 5, leave the exhaustion out of the room. I understand the instinct. You're overworked, underpaid, and it feels true and fair to say so. But in practice, leading with how depleted you are tends to work against you, not for you. It reframes the conversation from a business decision into an emotional rescue. And it quietly signals that you waited until you hit a breaking point instead of managing the relationship proactively. It can also land as an accusation, even if you don't mean it that way, like you're suggesting your manager let this happen to you. To be clear, being overworked is a completely legitimate issue, and it deserves its own conversation about workload and boundaries. It just tends to weaken a compensation conversation when the two get blended together, because it shifts the focus from what you're worth to how much you're struggling. And those two things get evaluated very differently. Save the exhaustion for a conversation with someone who isn't deciding your pay. If any of this is matching what you've actually experienced in a real raise conversation, drop a comment with what happened, because I read all of them, and it helps me know what to cover next. All right, back to the list. Number 6, never negotiate with a threat, even an implied one. It's tempting, especially if you know you're genuinely hard to replace. But threatening to leave, even gently, tends to convert your manager from an advocate into someone managing a risk. And those are very different postures. Once your boss feels threatened, the conversation stops being about your value and starts being about damage control. You usually don't need the threat anyway. Any competent manager already knows that every unmet need is one more reason you might eventually look elsewhere. That pressure exists in the room, whether you say it out loud or not, so you don't have to. I've seen threatened managers dig in out of pure reflex, even when they privately agreed the request was fair. simply because the ultimatum made saying yes feel like losing. Calm, direct asks rarely trigger that same defensiveness. Number 7, prepare for pushback, because you're going to get some regardless of how strong your case is. Your boss may fully agree with you and still challenge your numbers, because they know they'll have to defend this request to people above them who've never worked with you directly. That's not rejection. That's your manager doing their job. Think through the 2 or 3 most obvious objections to your ask ahead of time. Budget timing, recent performance dips, role scope, and have a calm, prepared response ready for each one. If the likely pushback is timing, have a fallback ready, like asking when a revisit would make sense instead of letting the conversation die on a single no. If the likely pushback is scope, be ready to walk through specifically what's changed in your role since your last review. Walking in with answers before the objections are even raised tends to shorten these conversations considerably, and it signals that you've thought this through seriously rather than reacting to a bad week. Number 8, widen your definition of a win. Sometimes the budget genuinely isn't there for the number you want, and no amount of a strong case changes that in the short term. That doesn't mean the conversation has to end in nothing. Extra flexibility, additional time off, a title change that opens a higher band later, or a performance-based structure tied to results you can actually influence, these can all be real wins, especially when cash is temporarily frozen. A title change in particular is worth taking seriously because it can move you into a different band entirely for your next review cycle, which sometimes unlocks more money down the line than pushing for a one-time bump right now. I'd also gently suggest that if the only lever available is a future promise, get it in writing in some form, even just a follow-up email confirming what was discussed, because verbal commitments have a way of quietly disappearing once priorities shift or your manager changes. Number 9, time it deliberately on 2 levels. On the bigger level, pay attention to the company's actual financial position and recent wins or losses. Asking right after a round of layoffs or a rough quarter is usually a losing move, no matter how strong your personal case is. On the smaller level, protect the actual meeting time itself. Don't ambush your boss in a hallway or squeeze this into the last 5 minutes of an unrelated call. Book real time, ideally somewhere quiet and unhurried, because a rushed conversation tends to get a rush, non-committal answer, and that's usually worse than getting a firm no. It also helps to think about where you personally stand right now. If you've just wrapped a strong project or hit a clear result, that momentum is worth using while it's fresh, rather than letting it fade into the background of a normal week. Number 10, rehearse the conversation, not the speech. Know how you're going to open, know your specific ask, and know roughly how you'll respond to the objections you already prepared for. What you don't want to do is memorize a script word for word, because the second your boss says something unexpected, a memorized script falls apart and you're left staring at your notes in silence. Practice the shape of the conversation instead. The opening, the ask, the pivot into objections, so you stay adaptable in the moment instead of locked into a script that only works if everything goes exactly as planned. If you can, run through it out loud with someone you trust and have them push back on you a little, because rehearsing the feeling of being challenged matters just as much as rehearsing the words themselves. So if you're preparing for this conversation, here's the short version. Get honest about the value you're actually bringing. Know both your market number and your internal ceiling. Ask for something specific. Build a business case instead of an emotional appeal. Anticipate the pushback before it happens. and protect the timing, both around the company situation and the meeting itself. None of this guarantees a yes. Compensation decisions run through committees, budgets, and timing you don't fully control. And that's worth remembering so a no doesn't feel like a verdict on your worth. But this approach consistently performs better than walking in on emotion alone, because it's built around how these decisions actually get made instead of how we wish they got made. So no, the conversation was never really just between you and your boss. It's between your boss and a system built long before you sat down. Understand that system. Build your case around it instead of around how you feel, and you give yourself a real shot at walking out of that room with something better than you walked in with. If this helped you see the raise conversation differently, subscribe, because I break down how these corporate systems actually work on a regular basis. And if you've ever wondered what actually happens in the 2 weeks after you finally get that offer or leave a role behind, that's exactly what I'm covering next.